And so there is perhaps going to be potentially a chance for Andy Burnham to do something for lower earners. I think it's still tricky to see in terms of cutting taxes. I think that could be quite tricky. An income tax would be very expensive. So I think he might end up targeting other things like benefits in kind or perhaps subsidies. So there's talk of kind of subsidies for bus fares.
Time now for our daily briefing on politics, business and sport. And let's begin with reaction to the suspected murder of the former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe. Police say there's no evidence to suggest it was politically motivated. But some in Westminster and in wider public life have been reminded of their vulnerability. The former Defence Secretary, Dame Penny Mordaunt, spoke to Cathy Newman on Times Radio Drive about the threats to her own life.
What I would say is, I've had more than 700 death threats and rape threats, including threats to murder my family as well. And in the last 4 years, I stopped being an MP 2024, but in the last 4 years, I haven't had a day when I haven't had a live police investigation or a live court case going on. And that, I'm afraid, is the norm now. But I think the police do a good job. I think there are things that could be faster. But Parliament now does look after its members well. And I would just say I've had twice as many people convicted for doing bad things against me than Nigel Farage has had people convicted. And many MPs have had horrific death threats from all sorts of quarters. So this is not exceptional.
That was Dame Penny Mordaunt speaking on Times Radio Drive yesterday. Well, joining us now is Alan Tolhurst, the chief reporter at Politics Home. Alan, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
I think the main sort of sentiment expressed throughout Westminster and across the country really is just total shock.
Yeah, absolute horror. I think as obviously when we first heard the news about Anne Widdecombe's death, there was no hint that there was any foul play involved, and obviously that changed yesterday afternoon with the news from the police. And I think it does, as you rightly pointed out at the start there, it shows that kind of violence towards politicians, whether this is politically motivated or not, is something that I think should be further at the forefront of our minds. I speak to a lot of MPs who talk about, I've got a court case going on. It's almost sort of blasé, and a lot of them don't really talk about it. Partly I think because they don't want to encourage further kind of attacks on them, but also I think because they don't think it will elicit that much sympathy from the public if they do. And I think that if the public had a more broader understanding of just the level of abuse that MPs get and the level of threats and the kind of the worsening of those threats, I think that perhaps things would change a bit more.
Yeah, and as we just said, Devon and Cornwall police say that original suspect, the 26-year-old arrested on suspicion of murder, has now been released and is no longer be part of investigations. So this is obviously developing and just must be completely torturous for Anne Widdecombe's family as well. Should we move on to some politics, Alan? Front page of the Times today, we are learning a little bit more about Andy Burnham and his era, what he's going to be doing. Hear rumours that he's going to cut taxes for lower earners. What have you heard?
Yeah, it's interesting because he basically made this comment that a couple of weeks ago that there was wiggle room, essentially. There was room for manoeuvre in Labour's 2024 manifesto, which obviously had these three very hard lines on not raising the levels of income tax, VAT and national insurance. And I think what's happened is that the forecasts from the OBR about the kind of the impact of the war in Iran have not been as bad as first feared. And so that headroom that Rachel Reeves had been building up as Chancellor, it might not all be wiped out by the autumn and by the time of a budget that it might have been. And so there is perhaps going to be potentially a chance for Andy Burnham to do something for lower earners. I think it's still tricky to see in terms of cutting taxes. I think that could be quite tricky. An income tax would be very expensive. So I think he might end up targeting other things like benefits in kind or perhaps subsidies. So there's talk of kind of subsidies for bus fares. That was something that he obviously did in Greater Manchester. And there could be something on energy bills, some energy support as they potentially spike ahead of winter, and so that sort of stuff. And also perhaps changing the way that universal credit is tapered, so there's less kind of punitive taxes on people who start work when they're on universal credit. So things like that to kind of try and, I suppose, that release valve of kind of the pressure that is building on people on lower earners, the cost of living crisis. Yeah,
which is something. Do you remember at the beginning of the year, before the Iran war broke out, the government said our sort of chief priority right now is going to be tackling cost of living, and then that became extremely difficult to deliver on.
Yeah, completely. That was going to be the big theme. I mean, Morgan McSweeney, back when he was still there, it was seen with this briefing note talking about kind of the way that it was going to be their number one priority. I think, which is interesting, given that this government, previously been sort of 5 priorities on this and 6 milestones on this and 3 first steps, and that was all going to be junked, and it was just going to be on cost of living. And actually the economic data before the war in Iran broke out, as was released by military in their spring statement, looked as though things were ticking in the right direction, and there was going to be a chance to do something more. That obviously events got taken over, but it looks like Andy Burnham might take over and try and pick up that mantle again.
Yeah, for sure. We are hearing, though, some tension between Andy Burnham's allies, and it seems, as reported in the Times today, it seems partly because no one is quite sure who's in charge of what yet, and obviously everyone's quite keen for the biggest job possible.
Yeah, it's quite interesting for a man who puts devolution quite at the core of what he's doing. He's centralised power quite quickly already within his team, and yeah, it hasn't kind of devolved out to various things. And I think it was always going to be the case. Look, he was nominated this week by more than 320 MPs, from all wings of the party, and they're not all going to be getting what they want. There are different things. The people who voted for him or nominated him all have very vastly different priorities, and even those people who've been working for him, who've wanted to get him elected and replace Keir Starmer, want different things. Someone like Josh Simons, who vacated his seat for Andy Burnham to run, is more kind of aligned to sort of the Blue Labour faction, Shabana Mahmood, and then other people like Miata Fambula, who is doing a lot of stuff at Work on Policy, who resigned as a minister. She's very close to Ed Miliband, close to on net zero. Louise Haigh and others are on kind of the Tribune, soft left part of the party. So yeah, until I think Andy Burnham sets out his team and sets out who's in charge of what, we are going to continue to see these tensions about what it is he wants to do. At the moment, he's sort of Schrödinger's prime minister. He's sort of the ability to do this and that, or both all at once. At some point, we're going to open the box and see what kind of prime minister Andy Burnham's going to be. Yeah.
Final thing, as he does that, we are hearing more about this list. Female Labour MPs and staff have written a list of, it's around 30 people in government who've been accused of inappropriate behaviour. They're going to present it to Andy Burnham. What do we know about this list? Is it sort of rumours? How credible are the claims within it?
Well, it's interesting because I was a political reporter the last time this kind of stuff happened, during the so-called Pestminster scandal in 2017, and we were sent the list, and when I was working at The Sun, and we had to go through it and speak to MPs who were on it, and it was a real mixture of people who've been accused of really serious things, perhaps unproven, but really serious things, and also just kind of a bit of gossip and rumours, but also things that had happened years ago. MPs who'd perhaps cheated on their spouse and then had a divorce and that sort of stuff. So it was a real kind of mixture of stuff, and it was really brought in because at the time the kind of methods for making complaints, the kind of HR systems in Parliament, were not fit for purpose. After that all came out, there was the creation of the ICGS, the Independent Complaints and Grievance Service, and I think there's a feeling that actually that was meant to have stopped the necessity for this stuff. And I think what it shows really is kind of the failure of Parliament to kind of clean up its act, that there are still these people around, there are still this requirement for this kind of whisper network, which is not really the best way you want to kind of conduct these things, but it is still kind of required. And I think Andy Burnham, if he's to take it seriously, is not just about taking the names on that seriously, but also just the process in general that leads to these lists being put together. Actually, those people who are accused of things are properly dealt with, and it doesn't have to lead to this kind of background network.
But also checking that if your name is on there, you've actually done something wrong.
Well, yeah, entirely, because a lot of it, like I said last time round, we would front up MPs who, so one of them was a completely mistaken identity. 2 MPs had been confused with each other, and one person was on that list whose name was confused with someone else. So these things do happen, and I think it kind of shows that actually, by doing it, this kind of whisper network, it can lead to kind of things, people being put on a list who either don't need to be there or should not be on the same list as people who are accused of sometimes very serious things.
Yeah, Alan, thank you for the update. Alan Tolhurst, the chief reporter at Politics Home.
Andy Burnham loves buses, doesn't he? So bus fares are potentially in his sights for his first few days in office, as per the Greater Manchester B network.
But I think that doesn't quite make sense, because he wants there to be more devolved powers. So then it would be the people looking after those regions that determine the bus fares, surely.
It's certainly appeal, and buses are at the heart of so much of kind of life, aren't they? So Jenny gets in touch saying, fingers crossed for free bus fares for 16 to 21-year-olds. A bus pass for each of my college-age aged kids is over £600 each for the year. I'm not on benefits, but neither am I rich. I have no idea how I'm going to afford to get them to college and back, says Jenny in Kent. The free bus pass thing is really interesting because this is a thing in Scotland, and there was real concern actually that what was happening was young people were getting on buses for free, travelling to a different part of the country, being antisocial, causing trouble, having a scrap with people there, and then hopping back on the bus and going home again. And where they would be known by police officers in their local area as troublemakers, ones to watch, they go somewhere where the police officers don't know them, and it all gets a bit more difficult. So, I mean, that is a downside, just to sort of float it, although I appreciate that free bus fares are attractive, especially if you're a young person trying to get your first job and all that kind of stuff.